Hi, my name is Jessica, and today I will be presenting on my project focused on evaluating the Social Vulnerability Index and the Healthy Places Index for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations in California. I'll be probably using a lot of acronyms because they're really long names, so I'll abbreviate them as SVI, HPI, and NHPI probably going forward. And yeah, my mentor is Ellen, and it's part of the IRA. So kind of just a quick overview in terms of my plot chart. I mainly started looking at this project as part of the NHPI COVID-19 Data Policy Lab that I'm a part of. We found that NHPIs are most disadvantaged in terms of COVID case and death rates, but they're underrepresented in common neighborhood equity metrics, specifically the HPI. And so I wanted to see how representative the SVI is of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations compared to the HPI, and then have that as a kind of a measure of improving calculations in the future to better represent minority groups such as NHPIs in overall other disasters that might come up. In terms of my overall process, I looked at the most vulnerable census tracts in each county by index score, and I used that because each county kind of looks at the most vulnerable counties or census tracts, and that's how they allocate different government resources and funding, such as vaccines and things like that. And I compared each racial or ethnic group in these aggregated tracts with their percent in the county overall to determine if they were over or underrepresented. And overall, my conclusions were that the SVI and HPI don't really accurately represent NHPIs in California. Hispanic or Latino populations are the most overrepresented, and within NHPI subgroups, Native Hawaiians are more underrepresented, and Samoans are less underrepresented. So kind of just going back into my main motivation, it is because of COVID-19 racial or ethnic disparities, where Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders experience the highest case and death rates. If you look at this graph, you can see kind of alarming. NHPIs have a much higher death rate compared to any other major racial or ethnic group. But in terms of COVID-19 resource allocation, we found that the index currently used, which is the Healthy Places Index, or the HPI, was underrepresenting NHPI populations. And this is the version 2.0 that was used during COVID. They actually recently released a new version that kind of updates the index score. So that's the HPI. I also wanted to look at a really commonly used metric as well called the Social Vulnerability Index, developed by the CDC. So far, it's mainly used for disastrous events to allocate FEMA resources. And it's used more federally, but non-Californian. This is due to an interesting proposition in California that prohibits the use of race or ethnicity explicitly as a factor in allocating government funding. So I kind of wanted to see if that would actually make a difference between the SVI and the HPI. Because if you see in this main table here, the HPI and the SVI have more or less similar indicators that it uses to calculate their overall index score. The biggest ones are economic, household characteristics, housing, and transportation. But notably, the SVI does include racial and ethnic minority status. So I did want to see, compared to the HPI, if that would better represent NHPI populations. That was my hypothesis. So my overall question was, if the SVI was used instead of the HPI, would the NHPI community be more likely to receive COVID-19 resources where they lived? And I was actually able to kind of expand on this question and look at the newly released version of the HPI that I mentioned earlier, the HPI 3.0, and see if that had any improvements relative to the previous version as well. So in terms of my overall process, I obtained data sets from HPI, SVI, and census tracts. Some of them are more publicly downloadable than others. The HPI specifically has an interesting API key. That was pretty cool. So yeah, these are the main data sets I worked with. I imported everything into Excel. There were a lot of extra columns. There's just like so much data, so I was able to condense it from like 700 plus to 41 columns. I imported everything into Jupyter Notebooks or Python script and analyze, combined everything and kind of cleaned everything up. And then in terms of my data analysis, this is kind of a general gist of how it works. I imagine all the diamonds as all the census tracts in California. I took the top 25% most vulnerable census tracts by SPI ranking, and then also later HPI 3.0 ranking. I aggregated them by the county that they were in, so that I found the aggregate of most census tracts in each county. And then I compared that aggregate and looked at the percent of each racial or ethnic group in that aggregate of census tracts with the percent of that group in the overall county. And that's how I determined if they were over or underrepresented in the county. And as a general gist, this is kind of, these are like the overview of my results. If you look at, there's a lot going on in this graph. This is kind of just to like see everything. But if you look here, there's actually not really a huge difference between all three kind of index scores, except for Asian alone. The SPI is actually a little bit more, like it underrepresents more racial ethnic groups than the HPI does. So basically the higher the percentage value basically means there are more percentage of California counties that are underrepresented. And so if you look at NHPI alone specifically, you'll see that the SPI is actually the worst in terms of it underrepresents 49% of California counties versus 43 and 40% in the HPI versions. It's not a huge difference, but it's still kind of interesting compared to what my hypothesis would have been. And then I also looked at how like the magnitude of over and underrepresentation in each index. And I found that the NHPI population was approximately 4 times less represented than Hispanic or Latino populations at 10% versus 40%, and then around 3% or 3 times less represented than Black or African American populations. And this was really interesting because this is kind of similar to what I saw in the HPI 3.0 and 2.0 versions as well, except in the 3.0, NHPIs are actually a little bit more underrepresented, and Black or African Americans are a little bit less overrepresented as well. And so this is really interesting given the fact that NHPI still do have the highest case and death rates from COVID-19. You would expect them to be more overrepresented than other racial or ethnic groups. And similarly, as I said earlier in my quad chart, in terms of subgroups, you can see that Samoans are a lot more overrepresented than Native Hawaiians in the SPI, and similarly, you'll see that in the HPI 3.0. Samoans are more overrepresented than Native Hawaiians. And a lot of this has to do with kind of the historical context behind it, where Native Hawaiians mostly had the economic means to move to California, so they're a little bit more, they don't live as much in vulnerable census tracts versus Samoans. A lot of them served in the army and came here, and so they kind of are more harder hit in terms of COVID-19 case and death rates, you'll see as well. So in terms of my overall conclusions, despite factoring in race or ethnicity as an indicator, the SPI doesn't actually adequately represent NHPI populations in vulnerable census tracts, contrary to what I was thinking or what I hypothesized. And I actually do think that there are a lot of factors that kind of cause this. I think the biggest one is how it factors in race or ethnicity. It does so as an aggregated whole. It kind of calculates the percent of minorities in each population versus looking at like specific minority populations, which has a really big, I think, error in terms of accounting for smaller minority populations. So like NHPIs, also American, Indian, Alaskan Native populations. In terms of like overall other conclusions, Hispanic or Latinos are most overrepresented. And then within NHPI subgroups, Samoans are overrepresented, Native Hawaiians are underrepresented. And there is significant variation that exists between counties. And then, so in terms of overall next steps, I did have a kind of wrote up everything into like a more comprehensive research paper. I want to look at analyzing like possible associations between where like different racial or ethnic groups are over or underrepresented, and see what the actual like their populations are in that county or census tract, to see if there's any correlation there. And I think one thing that would be helpful also moving forward in the future is to look at creating specific equity indexes for different minority groups. For example, it's NHPI specific equity index, just so that it can kind of complement these current indexes and see, find ways to see where it's missing. Because I mean, in terms of these scores, there's never like a perfect solution. It's kind of catering to what population you're looking for. And yeah, I don't know. There were definitely a lot of challenges in terms of calculating things, getting the data, downloading the data. I guess for the future cohort, definitely say to ask for help, like from whoever you can, not just your mentor. But yeah, that's my project. I thank you, the II, for a great year.